Welcome to another episode of Foundational Foundry, the tutorial series from the Foundry Roundtable. I'm Green Dragoon, and with me are my co-conspirators, Drogon1701, Duncan Idaho, and Mark Hockman. Today we're going to be continuing our journey through the different sections of the Foundry, and we are kind of coming at last to the heart of the Foundry, the map editor. And this is a place that you're probably going to spend most of your time. It's a big part of the Foundry, and it's going to take us at least 2 episodes to get through this particular section. If you added any new space, outdoor, or indoor maps here, these will show up as partially created in this list. Go add one real quick. Like that. And I'll have this big finish creation button. Or you can just create them straight here. So there are 3 types of maps in Star Trek Online. There are space maps, which are where you're flying around the in orbit of a planet and within a solar system. There are ground maps where you beam down to the surface and you are running around the ground in like a forest or a desert or wherever. And then there are indoor maps, which can be like inside a ship or inside the base on the planet, and which are generally closed interior spaces. I will go ahead and create a new map. If you create a new map, or in this case, hit Finish Creation, you'll be presented with a bunch of options. I'll go ahead and start with space maps. Obviously, your map needs a name. You can choose the type of map here, so you got space, outdoor, indoor. Space maps have the option to do a custom map, which, if you choose that, will literally just give you a big empty space with nothing but stars, and then you can add it to your heart's content. But you also have the option of pulling from pre-made maps. And there are a lot of them. It's a little hard to tell what they are from here because you're just seeing a top-down view.
Also, some of these, while they have the name of a mission associated with them, a lot of the ground maps particularly are obsolete versions that you don't actually see when you play those missions now.
Yeah, I mean, the Foundry has been around for almost 5 years now. And so a lot of cases, the map versions we have are from the original version of some missions and stuff like that. So if you want to see what Kronos looked like back when the game launched, one of my favorites. Let's see, do we have... oh, there we go. Sol System. So, for instance, we have a version of the Sol System that dates back to launch. If you want to see what this map looked like way back when.
It's a fun-looking starbase, but it's not something that you will see if you go to Sol now.
And I mean, and this has some advantages because it means that the maps we are working with are ones that players may not necessarily be familiar with. So it kind of increases it. We've actually even got a few maps that were built and then never used. For instance, we have, I think, just about every planet in the solar system has a map here. So Mercury through Pluto, which was still a planet at the time they added it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it still exists in 2409/2410.
Yeah, it hasn't gotten blown up yet.
Yet.
True. So in honor of that, I'm going to create a map based on Pluto. You can see it's not a complicated map. It's just got the Pluto and then it's a moon of Charon. So once we have our map, was it?
I was just going to say that while Pluto in real life does actually have something like 4 or 5 moons, the other moons are basically specks of rock that you wouldn't really care about anyways.
Yeah. And
by that same definition, the Earth and every other planet also has many, many moons as well. Because the definition of moon is just some sort of natural satellite. So anyway.
All right. So space maps kind of tend to look bluish like this, but once we have a map, we can start adding things to it. So first off, you'll see over here on the right is the library, and we have several different tabs for all the different kinds of assets we can place. Your map will always start with one object already placed, and that is the spawn point. We actually have an option here in Special Tab to add a second spawn point, but I don't think we have ever found a point or purpose to adding a second spawn point. Unless you're...
there is at least one. But that's in more advanced stuff. We'll get to that another time.
Okay. We've also got a respawn point. So, for instance, if we're our mission is to go explore Pluto's moon here, we can add in a respawn point, and when they get close to the respawn point, they'll unlock it, and if they die, they'll respawn there.
And a rule of thumb on respawn points is that you can have his. I don't know what the limit is on respawn points, but it's not something that I think you'll ever really encounter. The rule of thumb on which respawn point you use is just whichever one you're closest to. So keep that in mind when placing them. It's just going to be a matter of proximity. You won't have any direct control over that.
Yeah. You also have place markers, which we mentioned earlier in objectives. And these are tie into reach marker objectives, and they're basically like spheres that act as triggers. So place them, they fly into it, and you can trigger events off of those.
Mm-hmm. No event is automatically associated, but we'll get into how to work through that system later.
Yeah. We also have a...
for one thing I feel I need to point out is it's good to be cognizant of the Y value of anything you put in a space map.
That's true.
Because if the player goes up or down, they may or may not find it by simply flying towards the green circle they see on their mini-map.
And one little bit of definition, the Y value is just up and down. So there's a coordinate system associated with building the Foundry. And there's X, there's Y, there's Z. Y is just referring to up and down. You can change that on location objectives, anything you place in the game, really. So it's just something that's worth paying attention to, because there is that three-dimensional component.
Now it seems like a good time to talk about the other pane that you'll see in the map editor, and that is the Properties tab. So down here at the bottom, we can access the properties for whatever asset we have selected. If we have no asset selected, we can actually we'll see the properties for the map itself. So you can see the map name here and the list of the template map it's based on. It also has options for a backdrop. In this case, we have a selection of pre-established backdrops. And usually they'll give give a little preview image based on what they look like or what the mission they came from is. For instance, here though, to keep in mind, it shows a picture of a purple planet here, but that was probably from the whatever map it was taken on. The background will just be the distance, so the stars in the background, that sort of thing.
Yes, some of them have very unique effects, like putting a nebula that surrounds the map, or Unimatrix in one case.
Yeah, but I mean, these are the things that are out of reach. So no matter how far they travel, they'll never get to the backdrop. in space maps, you also have an option to customize, and I'll show this briefly, but I think this is a more advanced concept. So for the initial purposes, we're not going to get into how to customize space maps.
Yeah,
and then,
customizing backdrops is very complicated.
In this case, you have more than enough selections to get going just with the stock stuff. Oh, pick a nice blue space. Okay, so over here in the library, we've got our different types. We talked about the basic special items. Next up, we've got planets, which are pretty much what you would expect. Maybe Pluto's got a companion in this mission, and we decide to add another planet. I think most everybody who's played Stone knows this, but planets are not to scale. They're kind of a bit of a false perspective. We have quite a selection. They're usually classified by, like in Star Trek, the class of planets. So we got a selection of your Class M planets, Class L, Class K, Class J, I guess are gas giants, Class D planetoids. So if you're a Trekkie at all, and even a surprisingly large selection of Class Y planets, because those are the interesting ones. But you can see a preview down here for each one. Next up, we've got detail objects, and just about every type of map will have a selection of detail objects. For space maps, this is like wreckage, debris, stations, affects all sorts, small nebulas, just about every type of asset you can think of to put on a let's move Jupiter station into orbit of Pluto. So maybe we need a station there. These are basically all the inanimate types of objects. These are also objects that you can interact with objectives. Next up, we have NPC Contacts. These are non-combat NPCs. In the case of space maps, these take the form of ships. We have an incredibly wide variety from just about every race you can imagine. So let's say, for instance, we want a good old Federation TOS Enterprise, and they'll appear as a little green dot, and you can change its orientation. Put it there next to Jupiter Station. And these can be used with dialogue with contacts. So if you need to fly over and talk to an NPC, these are the kinds of NPCs to do it with. Like I said, they are non-combat. They will not fight in any way, nor will anybody attack them.
And if they happen to be caught in an explosion, they also cannot die. So they are just simply there until you decide to get rid of them.
Next up, we've got NPC Groups. These are the combat groups. Again, we have an incredibly wide selection from all the different races. There is something to note, and that is some NPCs will be friendly, and some will be hostile. And this has a lot to do with their factional allegiances. So somewhere in STO is a big database that says that Benthans are friendly to the Federation, but hostile to Vaadwaur. And the players themselves actually fall into this system. So, for instance, let's see if I can find a good. So we've got a Klingon place a Klingon squad. Well, this is going to be hostile to our Federation player, because Klingons by default are hostile to the Federation. But if, for instance, we were building a Klingon mission and we had a Klingon test character, they would be friendly to that character.
Yeah, for the same group, but it interacts differently with.
Yeah. Now, each group will actually have multiple NPCs in them. In this, it gets a little tricky with how they scale. A lot of the reason for all of these NPCs is to deal with the size of the player group. So if a player is playing the mission with a group of other players, it may scale up or change which of these get used. Especially in space maps, this can be a little tricky because not all of these red dots will get used. For instance, if the player is by himself, it might be just these 3 guys get used. If they have a group of 4 players, it might be these guys, this guy, and this guy. So it varies depending on how many players are in the group. This has actually been mapped out, but again, this is kind of a more elaborate topic, so I won't get too much into figuring that out. For the most part, I mean, if you just need them to fight Klingons, you place a group of Klingon mobs and go with it. I will say, in most cases, you'll notice each faction has a different, or like 5 or 6 different groups. The weakest being weak 01, or they'll be weak, and those will usually be like shuttles or something like that. From there, it moves up.
I was just going to say, it'll typically spawn 2 frigates.
Yeah.
It's actually the... it might not actually be the weakest, because there are also other options that will place shuttles and fighters.
Yeah, but I mean...
one thing to note is that, well, I guess we don't really need to discuss how those scale up, because they can scale up in strange ways.
Yeah.
Yep, and it's also all listed, too, when you're looking at the description of the unit type. So you don't have to memorize exactly what a weak unit does, just because it is available in the editor. But general rule of thumb, it is a very weak unit and something easily dispatched.
Yeah. For there, you move up to frigates. So you usually have 1 or 2 different frigate groups. And these are more like the escorts. So these are the ones you typically see, like 3 escorts working together if you're flying solo. We have 2 different varieties of those. And it'll kind of talk about, so for instance, this one scales from 7 fighters up to 8 fighters and 3 battleships. So they will go all the way up, but it's dependent on how many players are with you. You can read the description of what exactly they do. From there, we move up to cruisers, and those are a little tougher. These are typically 1 cruiser if you're just by yourself. And then the toughest mobs, which are kind of meant to be the bosses, though, with modern builds and stuff, they don't tend to be that tough. The battleships, and these will scale all the way up into dreadnoughts, depending on how many players you got. And they can get kind of tough. I mean, if you get like 4 or 5 players working together, it'll try to scale up the number of ships accordingly. And so what may be just 1 ship, if you're attacking it by yourself, will end up becoming like 5 ships, and so it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, 5 ships, some of them dreadnoughts, which aren't designed to be soloed, really. You can, but
Well, sometimes in a case of like Federation and Klingon, we've actually got special versions called rogue versions, which don't hold any allegiance, so they'll attack Klingons just like everybody else. And then we've also got a selection of non-combat. user description will tell you what they'll do, but I think you can kind of figure it out. All right, so that's it. We've got there is an unplaced tab. This basically holds any items that have been, for instance, if you've added objectives to that map in the story tab. Let me edit it quick. Objective. Okay, so add an objective here. Oh, I didn't do it right. Okay, I'm sorry. It'd help if I actually added in my map. Okay, so add in my map, and then add in an objective, and all right, so you'll now see that unplaced object, and it'll just default to whatever like the first alphabetically is. But this basically represents that there's that you need to place an asset or hook up an asset to that objective, and you haven't done it yet. So it'll give it a little warning sign and just kind of let you know that it's something you need to do. So let's go ahead and look at the properties. Obviously, the map didn't have very many properties, and neither did the spawn point, but a detail object does. So first off, we got the name of the object. We've got the asset it's actually using, which can actually be changed from the list. So let's say I don't want Jupiter Station more. I want a different station. Let's make it Drozana Station. So I can actually swap that from right here. Next up, we've got the position, which is the X and Y. X and Y is pretty easy to change, because you can move it on the 2D map. The harder thing to change is the Y value, which is the up and down. So that has to be adjusted manually, and frequently the only way to really tell that if it looks right is to actually preview the map. See, next up you have the Y relative to, and here in space maps, 0 altitude is the only option, but in other maps you have different options based on like the ground or the relative to object and stuff like that, which kind of tries to make it a little easier to place things in on a ground that may not be level. Next up, we've got rotation, which is be entered manually. It's a simple 180, or it's simple 360 degree. You can also, if you hover over an object that you select, you'll see like 4 little curved arrows around each side, and you can hover over those to rotate it on the map, or you can adjust it. If I want it only a 45-degree angle, you can do it there. Sound is something that showed up a couple of years ago, and honestly, I've never gotten it to do anything. So it's best just to ignore it. Has default prompt. Okay, so this is a obviously this isn't something I would want to use on a station, but let's say, for instance, I have a map with a console in it, and this console isn't important to the plot, but maybe it has like a some backstory information or something like that. Something that I want the player to be able to walk over to and access at any time, or as many times as they want. I can use a default prompt, and this basically attaches a dialogue to it, so they can walk over, interact with it, and a dialogue will pop up. Lastly, there's a second tab you'll see here called States. This relates to having, or like if you want objects to appear and disappear based on interactions and whatnot. This is a more advanced concept, which I'm really not going to get into tonight. But as you build more and more complex interactions, you'll start to do more with this. right. Let's see. Point out. Let's see. NPC Contacts and NPC Groups have an extra tab here called Advanced Behavior, and we have a selection of types of behavior. By default, they'll still go into combat even if you don't select anything. But if you do, you have extra options about how they'll behave. And again, this is an entire section unto itself. Which could be like an entire episode, and I think that's something we'll get into deeper later. Contacts have their own version of it. Well, that wraps up the different parts of the map editor. In the next episode, we'll take what we've learned and look at the two other map types, ground and interior, and see how they differ. Thanks for sticking with us so far. We will see you on the next episode of Foundational Foundry.